Okay, so I'm recording this webinar, but for those of you listening in, watching the video recording after the fact, welcome to our Lunch and Learn webinar on Bluebolt Solar Benches. So this webinar is intended to kind of just go over the process that we went through here at Cal State Dominguez Hills. We were the first campus to kind of adopt this project. I have with me Evan, and Evan, if you want to introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce myself and get started.
Hi, my name is Evan Siegerman. I'm a partner here at Bluebolt, and we're thrilled to be partnering with CSU DH and other universities around in the country with regards to our solar bench program. We appreciate your time, and we'll be available after for Q&A and even after this webinar if anyone wants to get a hold of us.
Yes, and Evan has all the information that I'll be going over at this webinar as well. So if you need copies of the agreement that I'm talking about, our feedback survey, et cetera, he has copies of that as well. So, so all that will be made available to you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ellie Perry. I'm the Sustainability Director here at Cal State Dominguez Hills. And again, we were the first CSU campus to adopt this technology. So we're just going to share kind of our process and best practices internally. And then Evan will take it from there to go more specifically into his company's services and the actual bench itself. And again, we'll stop the recording. And then from there, you're welcome to ask any questions you have. I also do have a Q&A chat feature loaded up on this particular Zoom meeting. So if you have questions as we go along, before we stop the recording, feel free to type them there. We'll be sure to address that at the end. So enjoy it. So I guess with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So, Cal State Dominguez Hills, I won't bore you with all the information of who we are. Suffice to say, we're located in the Los Angeles region. We're one of the 23 CSU campuses here in California. We were kind of the first to adopt this or kind of respond and actually develop an agreement around this very unique model. So if you're on this call and you haven't heard about what Bluebolt is offering, essentially, you get that email, the advertising email saying, oh, you could get free furniture and actually get paid for it. And you kind of think like, oh, how is that possible? So obviously Evan can go more into from his perspective what that looks like, but from the campus perspective, what we ultimately learned is that everything's really driven by advertising sales. So when you see that email, don't think about this as, oh, this is, furniture, or like thinking about, okay, this is an offer of a bench. Really, the model is unique in that the bench or the furniture that you're looking at is really just a vehicle by which to provide advertising, right? So the actual value is in the advertising sales, and that's how they're able to fund the furniture. That's how there's revenue that they're actually then able to share back with you as the customer, which is a very unique model, right, for in terms of the services. So that had never been done in the system to that point. So we were kind of the first guinea pigs to try this out and see how this could work on our campus and that portion of it. So back in January 2024, we said, okay, we'll bite. Like, let's go ahead and try to get something going. Our VP was very excited about it and said, but we don't know what this furniture is. They're not here yet. We don't have an opportunity to see it. Can we do a pilot, right? So Evan graciously just allowed us to do a one-time pilot, which we can't do that for everybody. It was really like, okay, we're the first into the 23 CSU system. Can we try these benches out for 30 days and just make sure we're okay with the furniture itself before we kind of commit to this like more unique model of agreement and advertising sales and all the rest of it. So he graciously provided us with 2 older gen models that we got to pilot out on our campus with understanding, hey, if we really like this, we'll sign along the regular agreement with you to kind of keep these permanently. We're obviously successful in that. And again, we have the CSUDH contract template, which is available to all CSUs. So if you are CSU, you have the benefit of having a CSU ready template that you can use if you want to sign an agreement with Bluebolt. So you're welcome in advance. In terms of that model, like I said, it's very unique. We've never seen that before. So really, once we get to that point, we're having to do a couple things, right? So the first step was actually implementing the pilot, which involved picking out locations. So us as a campus, we kind of said, these are locations that get a lot of high traffic. We were really interested in this from more of the furniture perspective, because as I'm sure many of you are, we don't have a ton of funding to spend thousands of dollars on nice outdoor furniture, right? That's one of those wish list things where it's like, oh, it'd be great to get more outdoor furniture, but we just don't have the funds to buy that, right? So to get, 2 free benches essentially was a huge win for us to actually be able to put that out on campus. So we effectively chose our locations based on a really high need that we had, where we have these major bus stops on the north of our campus along Victoria Street, but no seating. So anyone who's trying to catch a bus has nowhere to sit while waiting for their bus. So we were able to use these 2 benches to place them in kind of that key transit area. We just had some placeholder advertisements, if you will, in lieu of real advertising, because again, it was a pilot. And we instead put directions to our feedback survey, because we wanted to really understand whether, hey, are you as a user okay with this? Do you like the look? Do you like the feel? Does it work the way that we think it's supposed to? And those were the questions that we asked in the feedback survey. Ultimately, it was overwhelmingly positive. I'll go specifically into what the feedback survey said, but everyone was pretty much just excited to have something there, right? A lot of the negative feedback was more tied to us, like, in terms of, oh, okay, well, I don't like the location. How did you get the money to buy this thing, right? Which they just don't understand the model, and that's kind of on us, right? And like kind of concerns about security and things like that. But for the most part, people were just happy to have outdoor furniture that, we wouldn't have been able to provide otherwise. If we want to break down the actual survey feedback on, like, do you like this bench or not? Sturdiness was a big, kind of question we had. Out of a 5-star rating, if you will, average was 4.69. So users were pretty happy with the bench. They felt like it was pretty, sturdy. It wasn't going to collapse on them, right? Did you like the aesthetic? So overwhelmingly, people really like the look. You can see, it's kind of like art. You look at it and it's like, do you like the look, right? So, but, overwhelmingly people like the modern feel and everything like that. Functionality, so the people who are actually using it, liked it. They wanted to see more of these benches on campus. So again, most of the positive feedback was, you can see in the pie charts, was pretty overwhelmingly positive all around. And in terms of the free responses for the positive feedback, in general, people were super enthused about the fact that they were there. The fact that, like, especially late night commuters now had somewhere to sit and have lighting and be able to charge. They thought it was comfortable, aesthetically good fit for our campus, super functional to have this furniture around. And if anything, people are just like, how can we get more of these, right? Like, we want to have them in more places on campus. So that was the majority of the feedback. In terms of actual real improvement, just some concerns about, like, oh, well, is this going to attract a transient population? Because again, now there's somewhere to sit. There's some of this has been addressed with the kind of later models where, you put a bar across the top or something like that to keep people from actively sleeping on the bench. There were some minor improvements, like, oh, okay, well, it might be nice to put this in somewhere with more shade, but again, it's like solar charging. So it's kind of like, well, if you put in more shade, then you lose power. So there's kind of that question. Better protection for the weather elements or enhanced charging capabilities. But, overall, the fact that there was now something there was a huge win in general. So basically pilot went well, right? So it was kind of the understanding, like, okay, users are overwhelmingly on board with, like, we like these benches, we want more of them. Now the question becomes, we like it, now what, right? Because now we have to actually figure out, how do we sign an agreement along this very unique services model that we'd never done before, that no one else in the CSU had at that point. Really, it's the advertising revenue that drives the model. So beyond the kind of basic, like, okay, do we like the furniture? There's this question of, well, now we have to actually understand who's allowed to buy advertisements, and what kind of policies or protocols do we need to set up on a campus to actually do that and put that in the agreement in a way that makes sense. So for CSU campuses and probably most higher ed campuses, there's a couple departments or units that you have to work with in order to determine this question, right? So one of the main questions was, okay, great. So we're offering up our advertising rights in order to get this free furniture. So who do we already have exclusivity agreements with already? And that's something, especially in the CSU, we don't think about a lot because we've never really treated advertising as a commodity, right? And one thing that we found, which with your campuses, you'll also want to double check with procurement as well if you've done this, is that sometimes, people in different departments will be signing agreements for different things. and blindly just kind of giving away the advertising rights to it as just part and parcel of that, right? So you have to basically go through your past contracts and make sure that you haven't already sold the rights to the advertising for that particular item, and made some sort of commitment on behalf of the campus about who can advertise. You can't promote competitors. You're only allowed to advertise for this vendor, et cetera, those kinds of agreements, right? So that's one area that procurement had to work with us to figure out, right? The other side of it is the normal T's and C's, right? So, who's responsible for maintenance, like who's responsible for placement, what kind of commitment are you making? Where does the revenue share go? And that's more traditional in terms of the contractual negotiations for that. And I'll go over each of these in more detail too in following slides, but on a very high level. And communication. So the other side of selling advertising is that, okay, obviously you're selling advertising that's visual on the front of, on these benches, right, that are going to be publicly posted around your campus. So there's a concern from communications and marketing of, are the ads that are going to go up there in line with our brand? Is the content appropriate, whether it's the type of vendor that's selling that advertisement, or if it's the actual look of that particular advertisement, even if we're on board with the particular person who's purchased that advertisement. And then it becomes a question, well, who makes that decision? What's the timeline? How quickly does that need to be made? So again, communications became kind of a partner in trying to figure out how to address this in the agreement. And then a third entity, which kind of wasn't super involved in the process, but still kind of had some say, is that, universities have a philanthropic arm, right? So they're regularly asking donors who might be the same people that Bluebolt is trying to approach for advertising, asking them for money. So it's kind of like, how do you separate the request so that they're not confused about like, hey, I thought you were already asking money for this, but then I also got this requested by advertising space. So trying to figure out a protocol for how to negotiate that and some best practices. To dive down really into procurement, which is like probably the heaviest lift in terms of developing an agreement that works for your campus, is the process of cataloging exclusivity agreements. So you have to think about not just your stateside procurement, that's usually doing stateside operations, but if you have an auxiliary on your campus, who's offering, pouring rights contracts and things like that, that's not necessarily on that side of the house. You have to catalog what advertising exclusivity agreements they've made on behalf of the campus, and just making sure you have transparency on like, okay, we've already made a commitment to Pepsi, so we can't be, allowing Evan to sell ad space to Coca-Cola, right? So things like that, like basically going through all those contracts and actually cataloging that, and trying to make sure that that Bluebolt knows that, those are the vendors that they're not allowed to approach for advertising space. For campus specific things on our particular campus, so aside from the normal big contracts that you would expect, surprisingly, things that cropped up were, for example, our athletics contract. So they signed an agreement with Under Armour to provide all the athletic uniforms. And hidden in the fine print was a clause that said, you shall not advertise for any other athletic apparel companies other than Under Armour on your campus. Again, unless you'd actually gone through that process to try to sort that out, you would have had no idea that we'd already sold the rights to that, right? So things like that. Another common example, esports, if you have that on your campus, they have a lot of exclusivity contracts. Sometimes it's space limited though. Another thing we didn't think about, bookstore provider, right? So we have a third party running our bookstore, and they have in their contract that you're not allowed to advertise other bookstore providers, right? So all these little things, and actually tabulating that into a master kind of like spreadsheet of like, okay, these are all the things that we're not allowed to sell advertising space to competitors. On top of that, there's larger kind of state and CSU policies that you have to think about, as well as your own campus. So for example, a lot of the CSUs and a lot of higher ed institutions probably have policies related to what, when you can post things, what can you post, time or place policies, dictating what kind of content. There's a lot of things about like, for our campus, we were finding things like, language translation, right? You can't have just, a foreign language advertisement with no English translation on it. So again, good information for Bluebolt to know if they are working on marketing and developing artwork for a potential vendor, right? The standard things of like, no hate language, nothing promoting illegal activity, et cetera. So again, those best practices and just making sure that's really clear. clear. Also for CSU specifically, there are a couple state and CSU policies we found. So there's a couple executive orders related to alcoholic beverage promotion, smoke and tobacco. There's a California penal code related to sexual conduct under 18. So those are all the things that you have to look at and just make sure Bluebolt knows, like, okay, these are the things that we're also keeping an eye on, to make sure that when you're developing artwork, or, you know, a vendor is coming to you or a potential client's coming to you to buy advertising space, these are all the things that we're not allowed to advertise for. On top of that, you as a campus also have an opportunity to express your preferences, right? So for our particular campus, even though there wasn't a rule or a policy about this, we just had an internal preference for not advertising other higher ed institutions, because obviously we don't want to compete against ourselves in terms of saying, hey, don't come to Dominguez Hills, go to Long Beach, right? Like, so we wanted to avoid that conflict of interest. So we made that part of the agreement as well. And also we have, as an institution, we highly value sustainability, diversity, equity, inclusion. So we just wanted to make extra sure, like, hey, as a value, these are the things that we prioritize as a campus. And that's what we want to see reflected in the advertising that you're selling to potential customers. So that was integrated. Ultimately, this was located in our own internal Excel spreadsheet that we put together with all our campus specific kind of exclusivity agreements to let them know, like, hey, these are things that we can't, you know, sell advertising space to. As well as Exhibit B of our contract. So if you're a CSU, you can just pull Exhibit B, modify that to whatever else you need. That covers all the CSU and state specific regulations that we could flag. So that's in there. And then moving on to working with communications and marketing. So this is where the other side of it comes in. Say, okay, you figured out who you can or can't sell advertising, you know, space to, right? Now it comes into, okay, once you've actually tried to sell that space and develop the artwork, which, by the way, Evan and his team develop all the artwork. So it's basically they find a potential customer. They say, you know, hey, we can run your ad for X amount of weeks, et cetera, for this long. They buy the space, and then they work together to develop the actual artwork that goes up on the bench of, you know, like, hey, I'm advertising, you know, Verizon or whoever else, right? And so their team obviously has a lot of insight into the leads, you know, what runtime and deal that they've actually offered. So they actually provided to us via Google spreadsheet. So it's a drive that basically we can see, you know, hey, who did you offer ad space to? How long are they supposed to be here? As well as a link to the actual mock-up of the artwork that they plan to run. Per the protocol, our university communications and marketing has a window in which to deny or send back feedback. So if they click on the link and are like, hey, you know, we don't actually like the look of this artwork, it's too graphic, you know, it's offensive for some reason, you know, they can pull it from there or make modifications. Ultimately, it's in your contract, but the campus does have final say over any advertisement that runs on those spaces. So we can say yes or no, you know, and obviously Bluebolt just wants to make sure those requests are reasonable, right? Like they're actually, you know, that if you deny an advertising, you can't just be, well, we just didn't like it, right? There has to be some kind of reason, you know, try to be reasonable with like the turnaround and things like that. You know, but ultimately campus does have final say. Like there's never going to be an ad that goes up that, you know, you as a campus are not on board with, if that makes sense. Once UCM kind of goes through the list or, you know, says yay or nay, you know, Bluebolt ultimately takes the approved request, they design them, print them, get them installed on the bench. And the installation itself can be third party, where Bluebolt can send someone to go and do the clipping and send that up. Or if you prefer, you can do that internally. It's a pretty straightforward installation process. If you have a, you know, for example, facility services wants to do that instead. So that's kind of the workflow that we established with marketing, which again is in the contract as well. And finally, after we got those pieces together, there was just kind of this courtesy check with Philanthropic, you know, just confirming like, hey, you know, we have this vendor that's, you know, that we basically have advertising sales, you know, as part of our contract. They might be approaching similar people that you're also approaching in terms of trying to get them to purchase ads versus you're trying to get them to, you know, donate money to the university. How do we make sure that there isn't a conflict, right? For our particular campus, their response was, okay, well, you know, let's just make sure we're not accidentally, you know, double dipping on top of each other. So as long as you're approaching them with not using the term partnership, because that's confusing, because we kind of use that term as well in approaching leads, like just say what it is, right? It's like, hey, we are approaching you to buy advertising space on the CSUDH campus, right? So they're saying as long as that's clear to the person that you're approaching, we're fine with that. for their particular efforts. They're very focused on the Fortune 500. So they were kind of like, we only exclusively focus on the Fortune 500, especially if they're local. We're never going to run into them if you go over like a local smaller business, let's say a restaurant or someone who's part of the Chamber of Commerce for City of Carson, that sort of thing. So they were kind of making clear like, hey, these are the main targets that we have, so that they can just synergize on terms of an approach for that. So so that was pretty much the 3 campus entities on our side. Now, when it comes to after we figure out the hard stuff, right, there's still kind of the general T's and C's, right? Like who's servicing, like who's responsible for installation. So for our contract, when it comes to maintenance, facilities, here we just do all basic wipe down for any outdoor furniture. So we just agreed to do the same, right? So it's like, hey, we're going to just treat this like any other piece of outdoor furniture that we own, where it'll just get maintained and serviced in terms of like that quick wipe down through grounds, just like anything else. So we made sure that that was part of the agreement. Bluebolt, they cover, it's their unit, right? So they're, it's basically like they're responsible for major damage and repair and insurance on those units. Another thing, if you're a CSU, state of California, we don't carry insurance as a campus, in case you didn't know. So we actually have no insurance, which is to rely on. So Evan actually has made sure that their insurance coverage for that unit covers that and is reflective of that. And it also is a vested interest, right? Because it's Bluebolt's item. Therefore, they're making sure it's maintained, that it's, it's not broken, because obviously that doesn't help them on their advertising if the unit itself is not in good repair, right? So that's another thing that's baked into the contract. In terms of initial installation, our preference as a campus was just to do it through facilities because it was easier. The actual install time was maybe, 2 or 3 hours or something like that on one day. It wasn't hard to do, for facilities, professional staff, and we just had that preference because we didn't want to bring in outside contractors. However, it's again, Bluebolt can bring in a third party if that's your preference. So that's up to you as a campus. And then in terms of the coverage, so Bluebolt also covers the banners themselves. They can install that through a third party. And obviously delivering the bench to the campus as well, even though we took ownership, we actually went and installed it ourselves through facilities. Location wise, so where can you put the benches? So we as a campus obviously know where the high traffic locations are. So obviously we'll say like, hey, we think that the most high traffic locations are XYZ places. Bluebolt will just approve and say, hey, like, yeah, that seems like a good spot. We have some basic bullet points on like, okay, make sure it's not just hidden in a corner somewhere. You obviously need people to see it because it's based on advertising revenue. And then the available quantities up to Bluebolt as well, because there is a certain point where there's market saturation, right? Because it doesn't make sense to put, 10 benches all right next to each other because then you get oversaturated, right? And obviously available quantity on whatever Bluebolt has. So that's all baked into the contract as well. So there's some flexibility. This contract, especially for CSUs, the CSUDH agreement, it basically most of the hard work is already done for you. You could literally copy paste our agreement and be almost good to go. Obviously minus the internal campus specific things that I mentioned earlier in my presentation. Again, just check with your stakeholders in terms of your internal campus specific preferences and policies, and just make sure you're relaying that to Bluebolt, bake it into your contract if you need to. Final note, in terms of the advertising revenue. So that's the other big thing of like, oh, your furniture pays you, right? So in terms of that 80-20 split, which is what we negotiated, the 80% goes to Bluebolt, 20% comes back to us as a campus. That's totally up to you as a campus, right? Bluebolt just sending the check. So for us, because we Office of Sustainability are the owners of this particular project and this contract, we made sure to set up an actual dedicated clean transportation account because that's where we wanted to prioritize the funds. So the vendor reports to us as sustainability. So whatever checks we get from Bluebolt goes straight into that account. We can then use it to support alternative transportation projects, which has been a funding need for our campus. Again, up to you and your campus to decide how you actually want to spend that money though. So good problem to have. Third-party contractors are available through Bluebolt for any services you don't want to do yourself. Ultimately, that does come out of the bucket of revenue and profit though. So obviously the more money Bluebolt is able to save or make, if you want to take some of these things in-house, it's more money for the campus, right? So that's just another thing to think about. Also, Evan can probably go over this more, but there's a lot of internal discounts and preferred rates if you as a campus are willing to provide leads. So for example, if if we promote this to another department, let's say the theater department wants to promote their upcoming production, they could get an internal CSUDH rate if we refer them back to Bluebolt. So auxiliary partners, things like that. That's another opportunity for you if you wanted to help spread the word internally amongst your campus entities. So with that, I think a lot of that's captured in our contract. Evan's going to take it from here and actually go over more. We have Q&A after, so hopefully that's at least a start in terms of addressing some of your questions. So I'm going to stop sharing screen and actually turn it over to Evan at this point. And again, continue to post things in the Q&A if you have them. So Evan, feel free to take it away.
Wow. Okay, Ellie, unbelievable. I didn't realize how much we've done over such a short period of time. I really appreciate everything that you've done. And when you asked for a test, you really have made good, and it's really worked out for both of us. So I can't thank you enough, and Amelia, for paving the way here. And obviously, as Ellie mentioned, that CSU contract that they've developed is pretty much templated, and you could personalize any aspect of that for yourself. A couple of things I just wanted to note, and anyone can follow up with me after one-on-one or on this call to ask questions that probably everyone has. These ads are static ads. They're not digital ads. Okay, so it's a Duratran. The door opens up and the ads go into a clipping system. And while this is furniture, I really, and again, I'm not the sustainability person, Ellie, you are, but I really think that there's an incredible message that's coming across here besides allowing a third-party company to send messages onto the campus. And that's the fact that the schools are involved with clean energy and sustainability. And this is an important message to send. And that the students, faculty, and visitors have the ability to charge their devices. There's now on the new bench, there's 4 charging pads, not 2, and 2 plugins. And for me, this was the essence of this furniture. If these were just benches, it would have so much less meaning for myself, for the advertisers, and probably the school. It's a great message. There's some universities and Ellie, I'm sure will, when we install the new benches, you have the ability to put QR codes on the side of the bench that, someone could swipe a QR code and they could get led to other more sustainable efforts that the school's making, or even a school map where you could put a QR code for your school map on the side of the bench. I'm going to share with you the new bench, and I just wanted to touch base on the type of advertisers because I do think that that's meaningful. We think these are going to be vanilla type advertisers, and that there's obviously nothing that's going to be confrontational. A lot of the categories that are sensitive categories will already be locked out. We're anticipating recruitment ads, health messaging ads, hospital ads, Verizon, Apple, DoorDash, all people that I think will have some use to the college students and faculty and visitors of important messaging. So right now, we're fortunate enough before the units got installed with Roxanne at CSU Channel Islands, where Dignity Health came on board, and they bought all 5 benches, 10 panels for 40 weeks for $52,000 for a portion of the year, where the school's will generate $10,000. And the partner couldn't be any more perfect in that they're telling the students and the faculty and the visitors that they offer health services close by. And because they're recruiting for nursing, it's great for the students to see that they have jobs for them. So it really works out well. And we are very sensitive to the fact that this is your campus, and the messaging should make sense, and it is sensible. I'm going to try to share my screen so you guys can see. Okay. We put the Gen 2 bench on campus, and because we wanted to have two on campus so Ellie could test them. And now for the third generation bench, we've designed this bench, and as opposed to having two wireless charging stations across the middle of the bench, there are now four, two at the front and two at the back, and these are wireless. They're actually underneath the PVC wood. So this is PVC wood and steel body. And on the back of the unit, we have two areas where you could plug in your device. We also added strip lighting as opposed to a rectangular box light. We just thought that this was aesthetically pleasing. The storage for the battery, again, for the seamless lines, will be underneath the bench and not on the back of the bench. As well as this bench goes down with 6 bolts. That's all. Now, when Ellie and her team installed these benches, they arrived in 3 parts: the base, the body, and the top. We showed them a video, they took it on themselves, and they installed it very quickly. Now, this new bench will arrive pre-assembled on a flatbed truck. It will go down on cement, and it will be installed with 6 bolts. After they're installed with 6 bolts into cement, these benches could withstand 180-mile-an-hour winds. It's also, if you have a location where you want to put them, but there's no cement, laying, anyone who's on facilities on this call or is familiar with laying a concrete slab, it's not difficult and not expensive. So we could do that as well. So with that said, I just want to again reiterate that this is your program. We're here to facilitate it. We're here to give you guys the benches for free. We're flexible in most areas of this agreement. If someone found that their university, how many benches you get will depend upon the size and how many you like and the size of the student body. And if you felt as though you should have 8, we would certainly talk to you about having 8. And if you thought that you wanted to do it in 2 phases, we could do it in 2 phases as well. That was really annoying. Okay. So I think that's it. We're around for call questions or Q&A right now. And again, I'm around at any time. Ellie will provide my contact information, and in addition to her notes from this meeting, we'll provide the new spec sheet as well. And I think Ellie was also going to provide the survey, which most of you should have received, as well as her contract.
Yeah, and again, all those resources will be in the follow-up email to everyone who registered for this webinar. So I guess with that, we'll go ahead and stop the recording. Again, this will be emailed out after the fact, just to make sure that anyone who wants to ask questions, you're not going to be recorded. So feel free to ask those. So I'll conclude that now.